Claire Morgan arrived 10 minutes early, even though she told herself she wouldn't. It was a habit she'd never managed to break. Being prepared, being punctual, being the kind of person who didn't waste time. The restaurant was one of those places people chose to impress someone else. Soft amber lighting, polished wood tables, music low enough to pretend it wasn't there. Not her style. She'd picked it because it was neutral, anonymous, a place where no one would expect her to belong. That mattered tonight. Claire smoothed the sleeve of her dark coat as the host led her to a small table near the window. She thanked him with a polite smile, the kind she'd perfected over years of meetings and negotiations, and sat down. A glass of water waited for her, already sweating onto the white tablecloth. She checked her phone once, no messages. That was fine, she told herself. She was early. This wasn't supposed to be a big deal. Just a blind date. No last names. No job titles. No expectations. She'd signed up under her middle name, used an old photo where she looked softer, less guarded. Tonight wasn't about power or success. It was an experiment. A small, controlled risk. 30 minutes passed. The waiter returned to ask if she wanted to order. Claire glanced at the empty chair across from her and shook her head. "I'll wait," she said. He nodded, professional, pretending not to notice. By the time the glass of water had gone warm, she understood. He wasn't coming. No text, no excuse, just silence. Claire felt the familiar instinct rise. Cut the loss, stand up, walk away with dignity and tact. That was how she handled setbacks. That was how she handled everything. She told herself she'd leave in 5 minutes. Just 5. Her gaze drifted toward the door again. Then, without meaning to, shifted slightly to the table beside hers. A man sat there alone. He hadn't been there when she arrived. Or maybe he had, and she hadn't noticed. He wore a worn jacket draped over the back of his chair, the elbows faded like it had seen years of use. His posture was still, almost careful, as if he'd learned not to take up too much space. A phone lay face down in front of him, a glass of water, untouched. He didn't look angry, he looked resigned, like someone who'd already accepted how the night would end. Claire looked away, uncomfortable with the recognition she felt. Two strangers, side by side, waiting for people who weren't coming. It felt absurd, almost cruel. She checked her phone again. Nothing. 5 minutes became 10. 10 became 20. The man beside her shifted slightly in his seat. Claire sensed it before she saw it. That quiet awareness you get in waiting rooms and airports when time stretches thin. She kept her eyes on the door, but she heard him lean closer. When he spoke, his voice was low, hesitant, as if he might change his mind halfway through the sentence. "Your blind date didn't show up either?" The question caught her off guard. Claire's first instinct was to shut it down. She could offer a polite smile, a vague answer, return to her phone, end it cleanly. But something in his tone stopped her. There was no flirtation there, no agenda, just an acknowledgement of the shared discomfort hanging between them. She turned her head slightly and met his eyes. They were tired eyes, not the kind that came from a late night or a bad sleep, but the deeper kind, the kind that belonged to someone who carried responsibility quietly, day after day. "No," she said. The word came out sharper than she intended. She softened it with a small exhale. "Apparently not." The man nodded, like that confirmed something he already knew. He didn't apologize for intruding. He didn't offer sympathy. He just accepted it. "First time, Honorm?" he asked. Claire hesitated. She could lie. She was good at lying when it served a purpose. But tonight didn't feel like the place for it. "Yes," she admitted. He let out a breath that was almost a laugh. "First time in a long time for me." He picked up his glass of water, studied it for a moment, then set it back down without drinking. "I wasn't even sure I wanted to come," he added. "My neighbor offered to watch my son. I figured, why not? Worst case, I'd sit here for an hour and go home." The word son landed heavier than she expected. Claire felt something subtle shift inside her, a small crack in the armor she hadn't realized was so tight. This man wasn't here chasing distraction. He'd stepped out of a life built around someone else. "How old?" she asked, surprising herself. "7," he said. The way his expression changed when he said it, softer, warmer, told her more than words could. This was a man who loved deeply, even when he was exhausted. "He asked me to bring back dessert," the man added, a faint smile touching his mouth. "I told him I'd try. Not sure they let you do takeout when you've been sitting alone this long." Claire felt a quiet, unfamiliar warmth in her chest. They might, she said. Pity policy. That earned her a real smile, small, genuine. Mutual pity, he said. That makes it sound less depressing. She almost laughed. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It wasn't heavy. It was the kind that breathed, the kind that made space instead of closing it off. After a moment, the man extended his hand, stopping just short of her table. Ethan, he said. Ethan Walker. She glanced at his hand, calloused, steady, and took it. His grip was firm but careful, like someone who knew his strength and didn't abuse it. Claire, she said. She didn't offer her last name. He didn't ask. Their hands parted and something unspoken settled between them. Two strangers, two empty chairs, one unexpected conversation. Neither of them knew it yet, but this night, this ordinary, disappointing night, had already changed shape, and neither of them was quite ready to leave. For a moment after they exchanged names, neither of them spoke. Claire noticed it right away, how easy the silence felt. Not the tense kind she was used to in boardrooms, where quiet was a weapon. This was different. It was the pause between two people deciding whether to stay present or retreat back into themselves. Ethan was the first to break it. So, he said gently, leaning back in his chair, what do we do now? Keep waiting for people who clearly aren't coming, or call it a night? Claire glanced at the empty chair across from her. She could still hear her inner voice listing reasons to leave. Work waiting at home, emails piling up, a full calendar tomorrow. She had never been the kind of person who lingered in uncertainty, but she hadn't stood up yet. I don't know, she said honestly. I've never been in this situation before. Ethan nodded slowly, like he appreciated the truth more than a confident answer. Me neither, he said. But since we're already here, maybe we just talk for a bit. Not a date, just two people who got unlucky on the same night. The suggestion was simple, disarmingly so. Claire felt the weight of it settle in her chest. A conversation without expectations. No performance. No outcome to manage. It sounded harmless, and that was what made it unsettling. Okay, she said before she could talk herself out of it. But there are rules. Ethan's eyebrows lifted slightly. Rules? She nodded. No last names, no job titles, no explaining what we do for a living. Just this. She gestured between them, the space that felt smaller now than it had an hour ago. He studied her for a moment, then smiled. That works for me. The waiter approached, hovering politely. Ethan ordered coffee. After a brief hesitation, Claire ordered the same, even though she rarely drank it this late. It felt important to meet him halfway, to remove any sense of imbalance. When the waiter left, Ethan rested his forearms on the table, relaxed but attentive. You looked like you were about to leave when I first talked to you, he said. Like you were calculating the exact right moment to disappear. Claire exhaled quietly. I was. Why didn't you? The question was simple, but it landed somewhere deeper than she expected. Claire opened her mouth to answer, then stopped. The truth surfaced before she could filter it. I don't like failing, she said, and sitting alone in a restaurant because someone didn't show up feels like failure. Ethan didn't rush to reassure her. He just listened. That's fair, he said. For what it's worth, I don't see it that way. She glanced at him. How do you see it? I see two people who showed up, he said. That counts for something. The words lingered between them. Claire realized she hadn't checked her phone since they started talking. That alone felt unfamiliar. She usually kept one eye on notifications, even during conversations. Tonight, the urge wasn't there. You're good at this, she said, half smiling. Listening? Ethan shrugged. I have a 7-year-old. If you don't listen, they call you out immediately. That made her smile, a real one, unguarded. They talked about small things after that. The city outside the window, bad dates, the strange courage it took to try something new after years of routine. Ethan told her about school pickups and grocery shopping late at night. Claire talked about traveling constantly and never feeling like she was actually anywhere. Still, she didn't mention work. She kept her world small on purpose. At one point, Ethan asked, Can I ask you something a little more personal? She hesitated, then nodded. Depends on the question. Why did you agree to a blind date in the first place? He asked. You don't seem like someone who does things without a reason. Claire stared down at her coffee, the surface reflecting the soft light above them. She could give a safe answer. Something vague, but tonight felt fragile in a way she didn't want to break. I wanted to see if I could, she said quietly, sit across from someone and just be, without everything else attached. Ethan met her gaze, understanding flickering across his face. I get that. Something in her chest loosened at those two words. For the first time that evening, Claire felt it. The subtle shift from coincidence to connection. Not romance. Not yet. Just recognition. Two people exactly where they were. And neither of them felt invisible anymore. The coffee had gone lukewarm before either of them noticed. Claire wrapped her hands around the mug anyway, letting the warmth seep into her palms. It grounded her, kept her present. She wasn't used to this, sitting still without an agenda, letting time pass without trying to control it. Ethan noticed the way she held the cup, like it was anchoring her to the moment. You don't do this often, he said, not accusing, just observing. Do what? Sit, he replied, without multitasking, without checking out. Claire let out a small, surprised breath. Am I that obvious? He smiled. A little. She considered denying it, but something about the way he watched her, open, attentive, unhurried, made honesty feel safer than deflection. I usually eat dinner alone, she admitted. At my desk, laptop open, phone next to my plate. She paused, then added, I tell myself it's because I'm busy, but that's not the whole truth. Ethan didn't interrupt. He waited. The truth is, she continued, her voice steady but quieter now, I don't really know how to do it any other way anymore. Sitting across from someone, talking without a reason. Ethan nodded slowly. You're doing it now. She blinked, caught off guard. What? You're here, he said simply. You're talking. No goal, no payoff. Just this. Claire felt something loosen in her chest. Something she hadn't realized she'd been holding tight for years. She looked down at the table, then back up at him. I guess I am, she said softly. They fell into a brief silence. Not an empty one, a thoughtful one. Ethan leaned back slightly, his expression turning more reflective. People see one thing when they look at me, he said. They see a dad. She tilted her head. And you're not? I am, he said quickly. I love being his dad. It's the best thing in my life. But sometimes it feels like that's all anyone notices. Like the rest of me disappeared somewhere along the way. Claire felt the words resonate deeper than she expected. What about before, she asked. Before it was just you and him? Ethan hesitated. His fingers traced the rim of his mug in slow, absent circles. Before I had plans, he said. Ideas about who I'd be, what my life would look like. He smiled faintly. Some of those plans didn't survive reality. She heard what he wasn't saying. Loss, responsibility, sacrifice. How long has it been? She asked gently. 3 years, he replied. His mom left when he was 4. He shrugged, but the movement carried weight. She decided motherhood wasn't what she wanted. I don't hate her for it. I just wish she'd figured that out sooner. Claire respected the restraint in his voice. No bitterness, no drama, just truth. That must have been hard, she said. It was, he admitted. Still is some days. But he's a good kid. He's happy. That matters. She watched him as he spoke about his son, the way his posture shifted, the quiet pride mixed with exhaustion. This was a man who showed up, even when it cost him parts of himself. Do you ever resent it? Claire asked before she could stop herself. Having to be everything? Ethan met her eyes. He didn't flinch. Sometimes, he said, and then I feel guilty for even thinking it. He didn't ask for any of this. He just deserves someone who stays. The honesty in his answer hit her harder than she expected. I don't have kids, Claire said after a moment. I thought about it once, a long time ago. She swallowed. There was always a reason to wait. And then, the waiting became permanent. Ethan didn't rush to fill the space that followed. Do you regret it? He asked quietly. She considered the question. Truly considered it. I don't know, she said. I think I convinced myself I didn't want certain things because it was easier than admitting I was afraid I'd fail at them. Ethan nodded, understanding in his eyes. They sat there, two people stripped of their usual defenses, sharing the parts of themselves they rarely named out loud. Outside, the city kept moving. Cars passed. People laughed on the sidewalk. Inside, something quieter was happening. Two lives worn in different ways, recognizing the same fragile truth. That beneath success, beneath responsibility, beneath survival, they were both just human. And neither of them felt quite as alone anymore. The vibration of Ethan's phone cut through the quiet like a sudden crack. He hadn't touched it all evening. It lay face down on the table, forgotten. Now it buzzed once, then again. Ethan glanced at it, and Claire saw the shift immediately. The way his shoulders tensed, the way his attention fractured in a split second. He turned the screen face up. The name on the display wasn't hidden. Neighbor. I should take this, he said, already reaching for the phone. His voice was calm, but there was an edge beneath it. Claire nodded, even though something in her chest tightened. Of course. Ethan stood and stepped a few feet away, turning his back slightly out of habit more than privacy. Claire watched him speak in low, careful tones, his brow furrowing as he listened. She didn't need to hear the words to understand. Something was wrong. When he ended the call and turned back toward her, his expression confirmed it. Concern sat heavy in his eyes. Ethan woke up, he said. He had a bad dream. He's asking for me. The words landed with quiet finality. Claire felt the moment collapse inward. The warm, fragile space they had built over the past hour suddenly felt exposed, like a door left open to the cold. You should go, she said immediately, her voice steady out of instinct. He needs you. Ethan hesitated, his hand still gripping his phone. Yeah, he said. I know. He paused. I didn't expect this to happen. Life doesn't usually ask for permission, Claire replied softly. He gave a small, regretful smile. No, it doesn't. He reached for his jacket, slipping it on with practiced movements, the kind that came from years of leaving places quickly when someone else needed him. Still, he didn't move toward the door right away. I didn't want this to end like this, he said. Claire forced a faint smile. Things rarely end the way we imagine. The words tasted bitter, even to her. Ethan studied her face, as if weighing something. Claire recognized the look. She'd seen it in mirrors, in moments when she stood on the edge of a decision she knew could change the shape of her life. Then unexpectedly, he held out his phone. I know you set rules, he said carefully, and I respect that. But I'd like to see you again, if that's something you'd want. The world seemed to narrow to the space between them. Every instinct Claire had spent years sharpening screamed at her to say no, to protect herself, to let this be a moment, nothing more. Safe, contained. She pictured going home, her apartment, quiet and spotless, the glow of her laptop waiting on the kitchen counter. Another night alone, convincing herself that control was the same thing as peace. Her hand moved before she could talk herself out of it. She took the phone. She typed in her number, just her first name. No last name, no explanations. When she handed it back, their fingers brushed briefly. The contact was light, unintentional, and somehow heavier than anything else that night. Ethan looked at the screen, then back at her. I'll text you, he said. So you have mine too. She nodded, unable to trust her voice. He hesitated one last time, like he wanted to say more but knew there wasn't room for it. Then he turned and walked toward the door, weaving through the restaurant with the quiet purpose of someone who always put others first. Claire watched him leave. The chair across from her was empty again. Her phone buzzed almost immediately. It was really nice meeting you, Claire. Thank you for tonight. She stared at the message, her thumb hovering above the screen. A dozen responses formed and disappeared. None of them felt right. Another buzz. I hope you got home safe. Her chest tightened. I did, she typed back. Tonight was unexpected, in a good way. She set the phone down, exhaling slowly. Outside, the city moved on, indifferent as ever. Inside, Claire sat alone at the table, the glass of water still untouched. But something had shifted. This time, being alone didn't feel the same. And for the first time in a long while, she wasn't sure she wanted it to. Claire didn't leave the restaurant right away. She sat there for a few extra minutes, hands folded neatly on the table, letting the room empty out around her. The waiter came by once more, offering dessert. She declined with a polite shake of her head. She wasn't hungry. She felt full in a way she couldn't quite explain. Outside, the night air was crisp. The city hummed with its usual confidence, traffic flowing like it always did, people moving with purpose. Claire walked slowly toward her car, her heels clicking against the sidewalk, her phone warm in her hand. It buzzed again. She smiled before she could stop herself. How's Ethan? She typed, surprising herself with the question. The reply came a minute later. Already back asleep. Bad dream. Sometimes he just needs to know I'm there. Claire paused, reading the message twice. The simplicity of it stayed with her. No drama, no complaints, just presence. You're a good father, she wrote. He's lucky to have you. The typing bubble appeared, disappeared, then appeared again. I don't always feel like one, Ethan replied, but I'm trying. She leaned against her car, the cool metal grounding her. Trying. The word echoed softly. She'd spent years chasing excellence, perfection, certainty. Trying felt almost radical by comparison. That counts, she sent back. For a while, they exchanged small messages. Nothing heavy, nothing urgent, just fragments of honesty, carefully offered. Claire told him she'd made it home. Ethan told her he was sitting on the edge of his son's bed, waiting a few minutes before going back to the living room. There was something intimate about knowing where he was, what he was doing, without crossing any boundaries. Eventually, the conversation slowed. Claire set her phone down on the kitchen counter and stood in the quiet of her apartment. The lights were still off. She hadn't even bothered turning them on. She liked the dark tonight. It felt softer than usual. She poured herself a glass of water and took a sip, realizing it was the first thing she'd had to drink all evening. Her phone buzzed again. "Can I ask you something?" Ethan wrote. Her heart skipped, just slightly. "Sure." There was a pause this time, longer than before. Claire imagined him thinking, choosing his words with the same care he'd shown all night. "Do you think people like us can actually do this?" he asked. "Build something real when our lives are so different?" Claire stared at the screen. The question touched a fear she hadn't yet put into words. Difference, distance, worlds that didn't easily overlap. She was used to weighing risk, projecting outcomes, calculating failure before it happened. But tonight she didn't want to calculate. "I don't know," she typed slowly, "but I think the fact that we're asking means something." The reply came almost immediately. "Yeah," Ethan said, "I think so too." Claire exhaled, a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. She hesitated, then typed again. "I'd like to see you again. If that's something you want too." This time there was no pause. "I do." The word felt steady, certain. Claire glanced at the clock on her microwave. Tomorrow was packed. Meetings back to back, a schedule she normally wouldn't bend for anyone. Her fingers hovered over the screen. "Tomorrow night," she typed. "Same place, 7. She almost laughed at herself as she hit send. No buffer, no safety net, just a choice. A few seconds passed. "I'll be there," Ethan replied, "and this time I won't stand you up." She smiled, a genuine, unguarded smile that felt unfamiliar on her face. "Neither will I." They said goodnight after that. Claire went to bed feeling restless but lighter, her thoughts drifting in ways they hadn't in years. The next morning she woke to her alarm and reached for her phone out of habit, expecting emails, reminders, demands. Instead, there was a message waiting. "Good morning," Ethan had written. "I know it's early, but I wanted to say thank you again. I forgot what it felt like to talk to someone who actually listens. See you tonight." Claire read it twice. She typed back, her words careful but sincere. "Thank you for reminding me that I still know how." She set the phone down and stared at the ceiling, a quiet smile settling in. For the first time in a long while, she had something to look forward to that couldn't be measured, optimized, or controlled. And somehow, that felt like exactly what she'd been missing. Claire arrived at the restaurant right on time. Not early this time, not late, just present. She paused at the entrance for a brief moment, letting herself breathe before stepping inside. The room looked the same. Warm lighting, low music, familiar tables, but it felt different now. Last night she'd come here hoping for anonymity. Tonight, she came with intention. Ethan was already there, not tucked away at a side table like before, but sitting near the center of the room. When he saw her, he stood. There was something noticeably different about him, less guarded, more at ease. Like a man who had decided to be where he was instead of worrying about where he should be. "Hi," he said, smiling. "Hi," Claire replied. They sat across from each other, and for a second neither spoke. It wasn't awkward, it was full. The kind of pause that didn't need filling. "This feels different," Ethan said finally. Claire nodded. "It is." They ordered dinner this time. Real food, real choices. No more waiting for someone else to arrive. As the conversation unfolded, it felt deeper, steadier than the night before. They talked about things they hadn't dared to touch yet. Hopes, doubts, the quiet fear of wanting something and not knowing how to protect it. Ethan told her Ethan, his son, had asked that morning if his dad was going out again. "What did you say?" Claire asked. "I told him I was meeting someone who made me feel lighter," Ethan said, almost embarrassed by the word. He said that sounded good. Claire smiled softly. She imagined a small boy measuring the world through how safe his father felt in it. "I've spent most of my life believing control was the same thing as stability," she admitted. "If I planned carefully enough, nothing could hurt me." "And now?" Ethan asked. "And now," she said, meeting his eyes, "I'm realizing control kept me alone." He didn't try to reassure her. He didn't promise anything. He simply nodded. like he understood exactly what that admission cost. Outside, the city lights blurred past the windows. Inside, something fragile but real was taking shape. Not a fairy tale, not a guarantee. Just two people choosing honesty over armor. When dinner ended, neither rushed to leave. Ethan walked her to her car. The night air was cool, grounding. They stood there for a moment, the hum of traffic surrounding them. "I don't know where this goes," Ethan said quietly. Claire appreciated that he didn't pretend otherwise. "I don't either," she replied, "but I know I don't want to stop showing up." He smiled at that. "Me neither." They didn't kiss, they didn't rush. They hugged briefly, warmly, and it felt right. As Claire drove home, she thought about how different this ending was from the ones she'd always imagined. There was no dramatic confession, no certainty, just a quiet decision to try. And maybe that was enough. Back in her apartment, she set her keys down and looked around the space she'd filled with success but never with life. Tonight, it didn't feel as empty. Before going to bed, she checked her phone one last time. A message from Ethan waited. "I'm glad I didn't talk myself out of coming tonight." She smiled and typed back, "Me too." She set the phone down and turned off the light. For the first time in years, Claire didn't feel like she was falling asleep alone. So let me ask you something. If you were in Claire's place, successful, protected, but lonely, would you take the risk to let someone see the real you? Or would you choose the safety of staying the same? Sometimes the bravest thing we can do isn't winning. It's showing up. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. More heartfelt stories about connection, courage, and second chances are coming, and you won't want to miss them.